Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Popcorn Therapy. This is a little bit of a bonus episode. I wanted to do a follow-up to my episode on It Ends With Us, which is the film starring Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively. And if you didn't have a chance to listen to that episode, the film I found very strange. I liked some things about it, but I really had a problem with the way that it depicted domestic violence. Okay, so that movie is based on a book by the same name by an author called Colleen Hoover. And the oddness of that film and the book, from what I understand, which I haven't read, is that it's a fantasy romance about domestic violence, okay, about abuse. And there are pieces of the movie that I thought were quite relevant to the experience of being in a relationship with someone who is abusing you. I think it shows some of the gaslighting, some of the confusion, some of the seeing that someone is good or seeing their flaws while they're also hurting you, some of the denial that we can get into around what's happening to us, the difficulty of even acknowledging that there's abuse in a relationship. There are a lot of complexities to what's happening in a domestic violence situation. And a lot of the time we have this idea that, it's really black and white, that if someone hits you, end of story, then you just leave, and that's the only appropriate thing to do. And the problem that I really took with the film, despite some of its really good pieces, is that message, right? That idea that the main character who's being abused leaves her abusive relationship. And it's a real sense of like, you did it, girl, like you solved it, everything's resolved now and you'll never be abused again. And one of the things I was kind of reading into that movie is that there's an implication that she's going to now date this other guy who has a very similar history, and probably the same cycle is going to start back up again because she hasn't actually done the sort of, how do I put it? Just the fact of leaving an abusive relationship doesn't resolve the abuse and the trauma that's left after that kind of experience, right? It's not just about taking some time. I'd be a proponent of going to therapy. I think there are other ways that you can kind of process what happened to you, but I think there is a lot of danger in this idea that like, oh, you just leave. It's this easy thing to do, leaving, which it isn't. There are lots of complications to that and lots of reasons why people don't leave for long periods of time. And then secondly, that the fact of leaving means that you're done with that and that you can just move on and your next relationship won't be abusive, because a lot of people do end up repeating the cycle for reasons that are so much more complex than that relationship on its own. Okay. So that was like a very, very short recap of the episode that I did on It Ends With Us and the major problem that I have with it. Now, I mentioned briefly in that episode that there was some drama surrounding the release of It Ends With Us. Blake Lively was both the star and the producer. Justin Baldoni was the star and the director. Okay. Already, I have an ancient history with acting, and there are some issues with acting in the film you're directing or producing, right? Like, it's nice to have a little bit of distance. There's a reason why there's often a producer, a director, and then the stars are separate from that. And so there were some questions around, what's going on here? Why aren't they being photographed together? Why aren't some people are not following Justin Baldoni? Like, what did he do? And so in the last few months, there have been these lawsuits that have come out where, like, very long, complicated story short, Blake Lively alleged that Justin Baldoni was sexually harassing her on the set of It Ends With Us. And she also alleges that he created this smear campaign against her to take down her reputation. Justin Baldoni, of course, countersues and claims that she was the one creating a smear campaign against him. And it just gets more and more and more complicated. There are so many different aspects to this, and I'm not going to pretend that I understand everything that's going on or that I know who's right and wrong. That's not really what I want to talk about today, because there's just way too much of that, and that's not really the purpose of sort of what I'm doing here at Popcorn Therapy. What I want to think about instead is the form versus content, right? It's like the fact of all of the drama around this film and the lawsuits around this film are playing into the way that we read this film, okay? And the narratives that we experience around sexual assault, sexual violence, gender issues, truth. I think all of these really big issues are coming up as there's this back and forth and all these different lawsuits and text messages coming through, and like, oh my gosh, there's just so much, right? So there's an uncomfortable irony to the fact that Blake Lively is alleging that Justin Baldoni sexually harassed her on the set of a film that's about sexual abuse, right? No one has really talked about this in the lawsuits that I know of, the sort of odd parallel between these two things. From what I understand, which God knows, like what's true and what's false around what information I'm receiving. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a moment. I was just reading a few articles about it. There's tons of stuff on social media, and it's really hard to know like what's real and what isn't. But from what I understand, Colleen Hoover was initially very close with Justin Baldoni and like asked him to star in the movie, and then also later on she doesn't follow him. She's not comfortable with him at all. She's sort of on Blake's side. Again, I don't know how much of that is true or what it means or whatever. But in the film, Justin Baldoni is playing someone who is sexually harassing and abusing Blake Lively's character, and this is also playing out essentially in the behind the scenes, like while the film is going. Okay, so what I had heard about Justin Baldoni, again, who knows what's true here? All I really knew about him was he was Raphael and Jane the Virgin. That's like the extent of what I had thought about him until all of this stuff came up and until I saw the movie and so on. So I wasn't really following him in his career, but he was co-hosting a podcast on masculinity called Man Enough. I tried to listen to it at some point. I couldn't find it, or I just didn't have time to really dig into it. Apparently his female co-host quit that podcast after all of this stuff came out. So again, I don't know what's going on. I appreciate a man who's willing to think and talk about masculinity. I also know and have met many of these men who know how to use feminist vocabulary against women. It can be sort of a next level of manipulation and hatred of women by taking on that sort of feminist persona and then using that to gain trust and then hurt people anyway. I don't even know if that would be fully conscious, but that's something I've seen happen. And I wouldn't be that surprised if that's kind of what's going on. Like maybe he does have a genuine desire to think about masculinity and improve himself and all of those things, and it's just not working, or there's really deeply embedded intergenerational stuff, patriarchy, so on. Maybe it's genuine that he's working on it. Maybe he was using that, as like an image tool. I don't know. I didn't listen to the podcast. I would love to hear from those of you that have been following him more closely and have more of a close relationship with him, because for me, it's all kind of new with all of these lawsuits and everything. So how strange that someone who has at least put themselves in that position of really thinking about feminism, masculinity, all of those things, for that to be the person that's sexually aggressing someone on a film set in a film that's about that. Like, there's just something about that I want to know more about, right? Like, is it that Justin Baldoni was like leaning a little too far into that character? Was it triggering certain things for him and he was sort of acting out in these inappropriate ways? Was it he just a total false, like, who knows where he was coming from the whole time, and he was just like couldn't wait to sexually harass someone. There were also two men on the film that were accused of similar kind of harassment. Or is it Blake Lively, trying to make up this stuff? Like, I don't know, right? So I think as we're watching this movie, and again, I don't know if this is intentional, but we're encouraged to think about domestic violence and sexual abuse within the context of this movie. If you watch it and you don't know about any of the drama, that's what this movie is about. There aren't that many movies out there about that, showing some of the complexities about what being in a relationship where there's abuse, what that can actually look like and feel like and so on. And again, there are some really good things I think that the movie does. I think it captures certain aspects of it quite well. So you're being encouraged to think about this. And then there is this real life scenario that parallels what's happening in the movie except that it's on this big celebrity scale, and you can get all of this information, too much information really about what texts were sent and what lawsuits were filed and, what photos were taken or not taken, who was following who, on social media, all of these things. And so, for me, the best types of movies, books, and TVs shows look at us, the viewer. Like they want us to be the included in the process of telling a story. So, we're not just at a distance watching a story like, huh, that's fun or interesting or whatever it is. For me, the most exciting pieces of, whatever you want to call them, literature, pop culture, these ask us to think about our own responses and our own reactions as the person who's consuming that media. So this is a very interesting moment, I think, of there's the film itself, but then there's also, okay, what are your gut instincts here? Who do you ally with immediately, right? What are your immediate judgments that are coming up around this? And what does that say about how you have been indoctrinated into rape culture and patriarchy? I'm going to talk about myself here because I'm not trying to accuse any of you or anyone, of having certain assumptions, but this is what happened to me, okay? So again, as I said, I only knew Justin Baldoni as Raphael from Jane the Virgin, started hearing all this stuff, and the information that I got initially was Justin Baldoni is this proponent for feminist values. He's got this podcast about masculinity. He's willing to talk about these things. He's trying. Blake Lively married on a plantation without any critical thought about what that means, right? And I had heard, which I've later been told this isn't even true, but I had heard that she said pregnancy symptoms are just a way to manipulate men. And this is something I mentioned in the podcast because I was like, well, that's not someone that I'm likely to want to believe, right? So my immediate sense, my first gut reaction was to go with Justin Baldoni, to think like, oh yeah, she seems like a bit of a mean girl and he seems like a guy who's really been trying, so I'm going to ally with him. Okay? This is exactly what is alleged the smear campaign was supposed to do. It was supposed to program people like me who are just watching this stuff passively to immediately take Justin Baldoni's side. This matters partly because, yeah, that's our history. So many of us, regardless of gender or where we come from, we have been indoctrinated to believe men, to listen to men and their authoritative voices. And it is so easy for us, even if we are, like me, lifelong feminists, critical thinkers, all of these things. It's so easy for us to just immediately think like, oh, she's lying, right? And of course, I did have a little bit of that sense. And I think I said something like this in the podcast, like this could be my internalized misogyny showing, right? But my gut instinct is to take his side. And so I have to look at myself in this way of like, whoa, wow. Like if what Blake Lively is saying is true, not only was she abused, but there was a whole insidious, quite evil strategy to make me think exactly that. Also for what? Like, I think sometimes these things can happen where we don't actually realize that we're participating in the systems that are so powerful around us. And so I don't know what the Lively Baldoni internal motivations are, right? Like, I don't know if some of this is lies. It's all about my reputation as an actor. Some of it is publicity, if it's really about wanting to teach people to listen to women or whatever it is. Like, I don't know what their internal motivations are, but what they are doing or what happened there perpetuates this larger story that we all participate in, often even when we're trying not to, where we tend to listen to men and we tend to discount women. And I am very vulnerably telling you that this was my gut reaction, right? This is where it came from. I guess it was my internalized misogyny showing, right? Because we all have that. We internalize this stuff. And even when we try to be critical about it, it can come through, right? So just to add a little piece to this, the publicist who's involved, and forgive me for probably not getting these details quite right, but I think it's Justin Baldoni's publicist who Blake Lively is accusing of this smear campaign, she was the same one who was working for Johnny Depp when he and Amber Heard were involved in a lawsuit where she was alleging domestic violence against him. And there was all this stuff. I kind of remember at the time seeing quite a few social media memes and stuff that were kind of making fun of her, like her voice or how she was reacting to things or how she was commenting or not commenting. And that one was easier for me. Like in that one, I was just like, oh, that's so misogynist. Like this woman is saying she was abused. Like let her have her voice. I wasn't having at all the same gut instinct to go on Johnny Depp's side. And I have more of a history with Johnny Depp in that I've loved him in a lot of films that I've seen him in. You know, I think he's a great actor, whatever it is, but I'm not going to hold that. Being a great actor doesn't preclude you from being an asshole. And he was. So at that time, I remember seeing through that quite clearly. Like I didn't have a problem with kind of feeling like, oh my God, believe women, right? We've just been through this whole Me Too thing. And I think a lot of us, again, that the success of the Me Too movement was in part about reminding us, like, believe women, you know, believe women when they tell you that something has happened, right? And I think for me, I'm someone that, you know, as I said, I'm a lifelong feminist, all of these things. And a big part of that for me has been actually including thinking about how patriarchy affects men, thinking about how men absorb these messages and so on, the kind of pressures that men are under to behave a certain way or seem a certain way or whatever it is. And, you know, I want to believe a survivor. As a sexual assault survivor, a huge aspect of my trauma was not being believed. It wasn't just what happened to me, it was also these assumptions afterwards that I must have done something wrong. It must have been my fault. This guy was such a nice guy. Everybody was on his side, and I wasn't believed. So when I have this experience of noticing that my gut instinct is going to believe Justin Baldoni and not Blake Lively, is that, you know, maybe it's a piece of my old trauma coming up and just, you know, going back into that sort of narrative of like, you don't believe women, right? You discount them. So anyway, I don't have the answer to all of this. I'm certainly not saying that I've got it figured out and that I know, you know, how to deal with this. And I think there is a lot of value in being willing to sit with the discomfort of noticing what those gut instincts are, what those first thoughts and first reactions are, and letting yourself have second thoughts. Second thoughts are actually so much more important than first thoughts because your first thought is going to tend to be the one that is programmed into you by these larger systems that we participate in without being in control of. Patriarchy, white supremacy, anti-trans sentiment, like all of the systems, right? That's going to tend to be our first thought. If we only went around with our first thoughts, we would never evolve as a species, right? So we got to allow ourselves to have the second thought, like, whoa, I noticed that I just had a really judgmental reaction. Like, what's going on with that? You know, and to sort of stay present and aware that like maybe my mind could change. Maybe I don't have to stay so rigid in that first thought because I fear the shame of having been wrong, right? Which is challenging. Like that's hard stuff to do. But there's one more piece of this that has really been bothering me, I think. With everything that I just said, you know, I'm still in the process of kind of looking at my own first thoughts, reactions, feelings, gut instincts, you know, systemic, whatever it is. In my reactions to these two actors is the fact that what Blake Lively is alleging is that there's this company, let's say, and there are many of them, publicity companies, that their job is to program our thoughts. And I'm aware that I sound like a bit of a conspiracy theorist when I say this, but I mean that literally, okay? When we're scrolling passively through our TikTok or Instagram feeds or whatever it is, we're receiving messages, we're receiving programming in all kinds of different ways, right? Not just here, where there was a direct, deliberate manipulation of my mind around how I think about Justin Baldoni and how I think about Blake Lively. I was programmed to see her as a mean girl who doesn't deserve to be believed, and to see him as sort of the victim in all of this, who's just like this great guy. That was what I was programmed to believe. And, we're programmed in so many other ways too. Like, I've noticed that my mental health and my scrolling behaviors have a relationship, right? When I'm more overwhelmed, more depressed, whatever it is, I will tend to scroll more because it's such a passive activity. And it's sort of like letting someone else do the thinking for you, right? I bet a lot of you can relate to this, but like when I was in times of real grief or struggle, scrolling helped because it was like it drowned out the thoughts in my own mind, right? But that means that the thoughts that are coming into my head are other people's thoughts and feelings. And they're just little things that I've noticed, like there's a whole sort of algorithm out there that is basically, hey parent, this thing that you've always been doing, it turns out you've been doing wrong. Like, stay tuned to find out what it is that you're failing at as a parent. And, you stay on that video a few seconds too long and the algorithm learns that you're probably a parent and you're probably vulnerable to this messaging, so I'm going to send you more of it, right? And there are so many moments of anxiety coming from a place of like, when I had my son, I had postpartum anxiety. I've had, it's a whole other story I'll get into some other time, but I am very vulnerable to anxiety around parenting. And so, I'm getting more and more of these messages about what I'm doing wrong. And some of these messages are like, this is what could kill your child. And I'm terrified of that sort of thing. And so I end up getting stuck in this place where I'm being given anxieties that I wouldn't have even thought of in the first place, right? There's another algorithm that's like makeup, how you're doing your makeup wrong, anti-aging. There's oh my gosh, 40-something women. There's so much anti-aging in my algorithms. Plastic surgery, Botox, how to not fail at doing your makeup so that you don't look older than you are, like all of these things. It's the same messaging that I remember from when I was a teen reading teen magazines. And I was lucky enough to have a teacher in my high school who actually brought in some magazines and explained to us how each of these different articles and whatever it was were designed to make us buy more things. Like, he really made that clear, right? I feel like I was very lucky to have that teacher because I don't think a lot of people did. And critical thinking is not something that's being taught in a lot of places. And I think this is maybe worse in America than it is in Canada. I don't know. Some of this is about privilege too, what you get access to, what you can talk to your parents about, all these things. Because a lot of this, within the schools is just only so regulated. But I think a lot of us are losing our ability to think critically in the sense of, what am I consuming? Who benefits from the message underlying this consumption, right? Who makes money from me, staying tuned to this video? And social media is so much more complicated than the teen magazines that I used to read, of course, and like devour. I wanted all of that information. And it's designed that way, right? To be addictive. So social media is the same way, but it's so much bigger and it's so much more complex. And there are a lot of different actors that can make money or gain power or gain reputation or attention or whatever it is from these social media things that I'm just passively scrolling. And of course, social media is quote unquote free, which means you are the product. Okay. So if you're not paying for something, you are the product. You're what's being sold. And so, in my scrolling, I am there to receive messages from people who want me to get those messages, right? And they're mixed, of course. Like, there's so many different kinds of messages that are coming through. Like, there are good things too. I've gotten lots of useful tips on social media, and some of it is genuinely entertaining and fun. And, that's part of why it's so hard to step away from. It has that classic addictive quality of like, this is how slot machines work. You get a good result, you get a few quarters, and then you have a bunch of bad results, but you're willing to keep going through the bad results because you get the good one every now and then. And that's what scrolling on social media is like. You have this delightful video that makes you laugh, and then you have some messages coming through, or maybe some things you don't like or scroll past or whatever it is. So I'm not saying that we should all quit social media. I think it's really powerful in some good ways too, because I think it allows us to get a lot of different kinds of opinions and perspectives on certain things. I think that it's this strange thing where our awareness has the capacity to grow in a lot of ways, but also that growing is often siloed, where we tend to be in this echo chamber of really hearing what we want to hear and seeing what we want to see, and any of that stuff that doesn't agree with what we already believe is over often someone else's algorithm, and we never see it, right? So I think social media has this potential to show us different kinds of perspectives that we wouldn't normally get. And there's different kinds of awareness that has been revolutionary in a lot of positive ways, I think, on social media too. But there's the shadow is as big as the light, like they're both there, right? So I wanted to share my own sort of vulnerable experience with that, and how complicated that's been, and how much right now I'm in a place of like, oh God, I'm taking a little break from scrolling. Am I going to quit it forever? Probably not, right? I'm going to post some of this on social media, I'm sure. It's so valuable in a lot of ways. And also, it is programming us, right? And so for me, critical thinking is deprogramming, right? Critical thinking is at least that mindful process of sort of looking at like, let me notice how I'm responding to something. And is that how I really want to respond? Or is that right for me? Or, is that in alignment with my integrity, or is that something I just picked up? I think, maybe we've lost a little bit at that ability to be wrong, or to not know, or to listen to someone's perspective and let it change our minds. I think all of that stuff is potentially deprogramming. And I think that can be really powerful. So I'd love to know your thoughts. I'd love to know what you think is going on with this whole thing. If this is something that you've been following, and we'll see if it ever even has a resolution. We may not ever get that moment of vindication for one or the other side. I've seen lots of posts that are just like, they're both wrong, they're both assholes, whatever it is. I don't know. But we can at least look at ourselves, right? We can at least know how we're looking at these things and thinking about them, and let that teach us something about who we are, where we are, the systems that are controlling us, and just taking on a little bit of that, like, well, I'm going to be controlled in some ways. I am going to participate in these systems. It's impossible not to. And what are my choices around that, right? How can I be mindful enough that I'm at least attempting to make my own judgments about this sort of stuff? So thanks as always for listening. I really appreciate, I think those of you that are listening are interested in having nuanced conversations about things that don't always have, resolved endings that you can tie up with a nice little bow. Because I think that those of you that are listening want to think for yourself as well. So I just want you to know that I appreciate you for listening. And it helps me a lot if you do share this. Go ahead and use social media to share it. I've got programming that I want to offer. I want to, encourage people to think critically. It benefits me, if you share this in different ways. It's relatively benign, but it's there, right? It's like, I've got my motivations too. So anyway, like, share, subscribe, follow, all of those things. Because yeah, that's what we're doing, isn't it? So with that ironic ending, with that ironic wrap up, thank you again. And I will be back with more very soon.